Well, I appreciate the invitation to be here today at this conference. And Oak called and talked to me about a topic. We've gone through this process a few times before in other years. But he said, what could you do to help with helping people understand the nature and functions required to implement agency education? It's one thing to talk about theory, and you can get in all kinds of discussions about that, and I have been at all kinds of levels. However, when it comes down to how can you actually become an agency educator, as a mom or a dad, a neighbor, scoutmaster, public school teacher, kindergarten through 12, graduate, undergraduate work, it's the same process. It's all communication in some form, not just verbal, and it all involves a sender and receiver. And then you pluralize that, and you got more than one child to deal with. It's different than having 3 or 5 or 7 at different age groups. And so I thought through some of the issues, and I've, for this purpose, summarized them down to 4 elements. But before we get into those 4, and they are basically relationships, attributes of the intellect, it's number 2. Number 3 has to do with development, because you don't teach a kindergarten child the same way you teach a 7th grader or a 12th grader. And these are influences that you can look at as challenges or barriers that we need to overcome in order to be successful. But before we can even get to those 4 elements, we need to have you find yourself in whatever framework you're using and have been using and have developed with your personality and your idiosyncrasies and your mood swings and all the stuff that goes with trying to transfer information. And sometimes information is feelings, and sometimes it's cognitive stuff, and sometimes it's way out to where you think so far away you may never think back again. So I would like, maybe Oak, you could just take those. I didn't count them, but at each table I want each person to have a sheet of paper. And we're going to try to have you locate yourself. So if you got a blank sheet there, it's not going to be very difficult. You don't have to draw pictures. You do have to write down a couple of words or two. But I'd like you to illustrate it a little bit. I don't know how far this mic's going to pick me up if I lay it down. On that sheet of paper, I would like you to draw a line representing an axis, something like that.
Maybe just go closer to the mic as you're talking.
Oh, instead of going farther away?
Yeah.
Maybe I can lay it down softly and then do another axis that goes this way. Scratching on there. And we're creating 4 quadrants. And one that's been talked about a lot by inference and explicitly here today is the one that would be traditional in our culture in Western society. And we talk about that as being a theistic perspective, worldview. Oh, that's nice. And if you just write down theistic and right underneath of it, for whatever reasons might be in your minds, you could write down, let's see, how's a simple way of saying it? 2 dimensions, spiritual and physical. You can make your own shorthand up if you want.
Are we going to be writing something in each individual quadrant?
We are.
So make space for that.
Yes, don't use all the space like I'm doing. I'm trying to get it so they can see it on the back tables. And then over on this side of that, it's like a teeter-totter. Write non-theistic. And then what that really boils down to in trying to understand educational suppositions that we make and that we were raised with or not, underneath of that you can talk about all reality is reducible to matter acting on matter. Over here you've got 2 dimensions. You've got spirit stuff and physical stuff. So there's 2 building blocks for reality that you pay attention to. There's stuff that you classify as spiritual, that you can't see, touch, smell, but you can feel. And then you've got stuff that's physical, and you can weigh it and quantify it and talk about it in a lot of different ways. That creates an axis. Another one that underlies all educational theory. I gotta quit moving around. That's
Where do
okay,
you want to be?
right here.
Okay, right there.
The one up here, just put the person or the individual. And then down at the bottom, put group or society, whatever you would want to put underneath that. But this is more than one. This is just one. Now, there's the assumptions on your piece of paper that create 4 quadrants against which you can classify all educational assumptions or theories or approaches. And I'm just going to give you 4 examples that are common to our culture. You already know all of this stuff we're talking about. What I'm wanting you to do is find yourself in this chart that you're making. If you are a believer in traditional Judeo-Christian thought, you're going to be on this side of the teeter-totter, because that whole worldview says there's 2 building blocks: spirit stuff and physical stuff. Now you can get real abstract about that, and we're not going to get into physics and all that business, but that sets the stage for how you think. It gives you a tool to think with that's different than if you're on this end of the teeter-totter, where you say all reality is determined by matter acting on matter. Physical stuff acting upon physical stuff. Now, if you think that the most important way to approach education is to just deal with an individual, you're going to go up this way on this axis. And if you think you're going to put them in a group, and you know how that is if you've ever planned a family vacation. You can talk to one child, and then you can make your plans. But if you leave the other 4 out or the other 5 out, you might have problems later. So you decide, well, we better do this as a group. So some people gravitate down on this side of that teeter-totter. And if you turned it like this, then we're talking about another angle on the axes. But they create 4 quadrants. that go out in various degrees of commitment that people make. And one of the earliest forms of education, make my little diagram a little different here. Remember, there's two things there, like you've got on your paper. But we call it now parochial education. American history and European history of education and many other areas, we won't get into all of the different cultures and philosophical and religious terms that are used there, but there is a way of saying that the spiritual element must be in education, and so lots of parochial schools were developed. You can still go to a parochial school, whether it's Christian, Baptist, Catholic, or whatever particular group might have this kind of thinking going on, but they're thinking that we got to deal with this as a group of people. And that's an example of one kind of education. There are people, and we'll have a chance for you to express that have had experiences here. If you don't think that way and you're still thinking about the group, you can have a society running the show like we do with public education. But this is a foundation for secular thinking. They don't believe that true reality involves spiritual stuff. The assumptions they're making do not, they're exclusive. They don't include it. These people include it over here. These people do not. And so when they deal with a group of people, they're down here in this quadrant. The ones over here, if you went to Catholic parochial school, they would be not satisfied with having that kind of education. They want this kind of education for their children. And then if you think like some people do, and there's lots of experimental schools that are set up now, trying to say that, and I'm steering intentionally away from saying Durkheim and all the names that we could put in here, because you can put every educational theorist in one of these quarters in terms of what they wrote and how they dealt with their personal lives, and sometimes that's not congruent. But to do that up here, we take on an individualist approach, and we say, well, every child is like a seed, and if you plant it and you nurture it, it'll grow and become what it was intended to become. And we don't have to worry about thinking about spirit stuff. This will all be manifest in a perfect way as that child grows and develops. And then there are those that are hanging out and saying, well, somehow or another, we got this theist thing going here, and God's involved. And that means standards are involved. That's why parochial schools teach the way they do. And that's why when we set up LDS schools in the early history of the West, that's the kind of schools we organize. But we didn't really like some of the things that were going on down here. We said we ought to pay more attention to this person because there is such a thing as agency. And that's right there in the Garden of Eden story. And it starts from the very beginning. And that person has a chance to make choices. But when you're in an agency quadrant of education, and that's where your assumptions reside, there's order that comes into that, and you have to deal with what the commandments say, in spite of the fact we're all giving the opportunity to make choices. And later on, we will talk about more in that Garden of Eden event, because that simple little symbolic story has a lot of information in it that's very critical to education in terms of the assumptions that underlie the story itself. And so what I want you to do now, before we get into these 4 barriers, is where are you? Where's your comfort level? Find yourself and draw me a little stick figure.
So in one of the single quadrants, or like 1.5?
Okay, now we're off and going. We need to know how we think about education before we can counter these challenges that we face. Now I can solve your problem that way. So find yourself and tell me, just some of you raise your hand and tell me where you're at. And if you want to do it second person, third person because you're embarrassed about it, or don't want to share it, or whatever people are going to think about it, how were you reared to believe it? What did you bring out of your family background? Where did your parents want you, or where did they reside, and what was that influence like in your life? Yes?
Well, I was raised Catholic, and so if you were raised Catholic, you went to a Catholic school, and so that was very much part of our education.
And so it's a visceral experience you've had with a parochial school.
Right.
Were the nuns your teacher? Did they have anything to do with telling you about what God said you're supposed to do?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I'm old enough to where they were, yes, it was very...
Does anybody in here find themselves in the societal home when you were raised? You're on the other side. We're focusing almost all on matter acting on matter. We got science. We got a lot of things that can make life great. You did?
Went to a regular public school.
And that's what they taught you.
That's what I learned.
You started to raise your hand.
In my home, it wasn't that way, but public school was, yes.
Okay. Now, you can already see you got this going on at public school, this going on in your home. And when you were 13, what did that do to you?
Junior high, that's what it did to me, yes.
You know, and with that, and when you bring up the group thing, that was one of the things, granted that happened in my home, the way we were raised is my parents really weren't, as far as the ecclesiastical spiritual instruction, that did not come from them, that came from my teachers or the priests at church. It was very, very different than now I'm LDS, and it made a very big difference. Yeah.
Any other comments about any other places on that little chart for you? How many of you didn't want to do it all in one place?
I did it in 3 and made arrows back and forth, so like, it always goes back and forth. You can't just sync up with one.
Now, what's that going to do to your kids?
Well, we're going to teach them individually, and we're going to talk about agency a lot because they're the ones that have to deal with the consequences of their actions, and I have to deal with the consequences of letting them, you know, have to deal with that. But also the spiritual is a huge part of the whole thing, so I don't think I can do just one of them.
Okay. And anytime one of your kids decides something, that impacts you.
Mm-hmm. But we always will talk about it. We will, but we'll always go back to God. So I guess that would be the foundation right there.
Anybody in here got a child that doesn't want to go back to God when they're having a discussion with you? I'm telling you, you're an interesting group if you have no kids that are telling you that story.
Mine are too young still.
Okay, that's you're on probation. You're on the clock. Did you say something?
No, just I've been grateful that we're not there yet. So we're
Oh.
still coming back to that.
Do any of you know any family anywhere that had a kid that didn't want to talk about God when he had to deal with standards?
Yes.
I have one, an
None of you were like that. I understand that, but some of your neighbors' kids were like that. All right. One of your challenges to become an agency-oriented teacher is to find out where you're at. And then you got to figure out, well, now if that's really where I'm at, and that's really what I believe, and that's really what I think with when I think about all the things that come up in the transfer of information that we title an umbrella called education, that's something you really need to understand about yourself. What do I think with? And that's the assumptions you make, or that you were given, or that you acquired, or that you're working on, trying to get. And that influences where you're going to go when you're going to make your trips through these quadrants. And it's very normal for people to try one and not like it, and try another one and maybe like something, and try another one. And so there's all kinds of unending stories that go with this. And something you might have believed in at 20, you may have changed a little bit by 40, and by the time you're 70, you may have changed enough. Any of you got grandpas and grandmas, and you know they don't know anything about technology, because the grandkids have to come and fix their stuff. Let's hit the next slide. These are the 4 things I mentioned we're going to talk about. Just, you can get at these on Oak's site on the internet, so we're not going to talk about those right now. I want to get on to the next slide. Now, I don't know whether you can see these darker lines right here. These are stages that we get in as a learner, and these are stages that we go through as a teacher or a parent as we try to deal with children as parents, or students as teachers, or in the workplace, or wherever you're at. This little diagram we're going to discover has an impact. And I'm going to use our experience here together with me to kind of dissect that. When I came up here, age blesses you with many things. Some are less desirable than others. And a dry throat is one that comes. When I started out here, there was a certain amount of nervousness that I was experiencing. And that nervousness could be called, what's that first word? Inhibition. Do you know what being inhibited means? Tell me what inhibited means to you. Are you inhibited?
Sometimes. Means like I feel some kind of resistance to wanting to do something.
Why?
It might be embarrassment, potential fear of something. Something just restrains me.
If you're in a congregation in a religious setting and they call you out of the audience to come up and stand behind the pulpit, what happens to your emotions?
You feel fragile. I feel fragile.
We heard her talk about that. Well, after I came, I heard, what's her name from Bernal?
Yeah.
She went through a lot of that, apparently. Everybody goes through that. It's in the family as much as it's in a schoolroom or it's in a workplace. It's everywhere. And you've got to get out of the inhibition stage before you can begin to share, because you're preoccupied with yourself. I mean, what is happening to me here? I've got all of these sets of eyes looking at me in different colors, and am I going to be able to tell what I want to share to this group of people Well, if I'm going to, I got to relax enough so I can remember, and that's harder when you get older, what I'm supposed to be telling you. And you go through the same thing, and you go through it in your home with your family, with your spouse, with your neighbors. It's the same difference. Some neighbors you feel really close and comfortable with, other neighbors, not so much. And when you're in a family setting, one day you may feel pretty much in charge of yourself and what's going on, and you're free to do some things with the kids, and then you go into a mood swing. And your kids wonder, where did she go? And now here she is, and maybe it's whatever is in your head that's causing you to become more preoccupied with about whatever you're feeling than what you can do for them. And that creates distance. So as long as you're in the inhibition arena, you're prevented from displaying what you've got to share as well as you could if you were down there a little further. And there are some people that go through enough, and you heard those three on the panel talking about it today. They'll, well, this is how I felt when I first started being an activist. And yeah, I went around the country talking to different groups, and then it kind of wore off. And now one of them said, well, I just be myself now. So she's relaxed enough that she can get down to display whatever it is that she did all that research to find out that she wants the school board to remember or act on or do something about. So it's happening all the time around us. Everywhere we're at, it's happening to us. And it happens to me here because I'm not down to the point right now. I'm getting closer to where I can actually forget about the inhibitions, whether my pants are zipped up or whatever, you know. There's lots of things I could worry about, how my hair looks, or just watch somebody get ready to go out on a date. You can understand the rigmarole that life goes through with you. But in order to get contact, and that's where we talk about the full exchange between one person and another person can occur, but you've got to get out of this. You can't be back in that display stage. I know professors that would say, give me a bigger auditorium. I'd like to speak to 500 kids. In fact, on second thought, put me in the Marriott Center. I'd like a whole bunch of people. I've got so many things they need to hear. And they're really confident, and they're not having much inhibition about anything. But you have to get to that point where you move out of that inhibitory stage, get to where you can display whatever it is you're wanting to share. But that's not where real teaching and learning occurs that involves the spirit of your personalities. And if you're on that side of the fence with the theistic, we know that we have a special helper to work with us in that teaching learning setting. So if you want to teach with the spirit, teach according to the doctrine, teach as a witness, which are the scriptural things in our subculture as Latter-day Saints that we're asked to focus in on. That's the instructions we've got from our Heavenly Father, to do that kind of instruction, that kind of sharing of information. And in the meantime, we've got these learners, or the students, or whoever you want to put over on the other, maybe it's your spouse. And you found a time in your marriage, if you're married, and if you haven't been married, you found many examples of this happening in whatever relationships, that you can be back here as a critical observer. And you noticed I said, let's come off the back tables. Because the chances are, if you get a group of 17-year-old boys and try to teach them in Sunday school, they'll rock back on their chairs against the wall and just say, I dare you. Or be a substitute teacher somewhere where they've already run off 2 or 3 teachers and then you're brought in to steady the ark, those are all examples of, and I kind of felt like I'm going to see some expressions on some faces because I have to look at you to know when I can get by the mic. I think some of you are critical observers. You go, what's this guy going to try to tell me after I've been here for 6 hours listening to all these people, and you've got another agenda? And in a classroom, they'd be counting the dots on the acoustic tile. They could go Europa. Nowadays, they get their little smartphones out and they start doing whatever they're doing there, and they're not paying any attention to where you're trying to go. And you know that's a huge, big thing. Why do we have kids today in our families that'll invite their friends over and they sit in silence and text each other? That's a technological kind of, whatever you get committed to something in an overly fashion, it's addictive. And yet they're perfectly comfortable not saying anything verbally to anybody, to have all kinds of fun. It's an anonymity thing. I think it's an escape mechanism because they don't have to feel inhibition, and they don't really have to feel like they're on display because they can do all of their conversation in a form of anonymity. And that's not the healthiest way to grow up and have a family and try to accomplish the goals that we really want to accomplish in mortality. So my first issue with this was critical observer. Now, who's courageous enough to tell me what you thought about me standing up here, taking up your time? Who had some reservations?
I didn't have any reservations.
Nah, come
Sorry,
on.
I can't help you there.
Well, you're the nice man who helps me know where to go.
Oh, I told her where the elevator was so she didn't get lost and end up on the second floor. It's like thinking you're going to the celestial kingdom and you end up in the terrestrial order down there because that's where the elevator stopped.
I felt an air of confidence coming from him.
Yeah.
You know, you hadn't said anything when you started, so I felt like I wanted to listen to what you said.
So that was positive. Sometimes you think there's an air of confidence that you don't think so positive.
Yeah, arrogance.
Yeah, like arrogance. Anybody got any questions or any comments you want to make about that chart?
What does radiation look like?
What does
radiation look like?
What does radiation look like when somebody is not thinking about themselves and they're not worrying about whether their makeup's on or the mascara is dripping or not? What is it? Answer his question is what I want you to do, because you're the authorities on this.
Isn't it speaking spirit to spirit?
It is.
Speaking to their spirit.
It is, but I want you to articulate it. You're staring at me like you are. Come back here in that intellectual curiosity state, aren't you?
Yeah.
And you're afraid of something because, well, you're just, afraid is not the right word. You're not going to just buy into any old thing I say, right?
Right.
And when I'm this close to you, things are already going on between us, right? And if I get any closer, you're going to feel invaded. She's courageous. Do you know what I'm trying to get to you? We can't discuss all of these things in great depth in 20 minutes, but we can learn what it is we need to overcome. And I can tell you that if you've got 7 kids and you're trying to teach them something in your home, and they're all in the critical observer or apathetic, it doesn't have to be this negative judgmental thing. It can be, oh, not again. We're going to have to do what? Anybody had an experience like that?
Sounds like family home evening.
Sounds like family home evening. That's a perfect place to see this operate. The dinner table, when they hide their peas or food under the table or something so they don't have to eat them if that's what you want them to do. It manifests in all of our behaviors. You know enough about what I'm talking about that that's a barrier to becoming an agency teacher or parent. If you're going to be able to deal with them spirit to spirit, as you just said, then you've got to get rid of the inhibitions that you have, and you've got to get them to get rid of the critical observer and apathy and whatever else you want to list up there that can cause a breach in the transfer of information. And if you just get somebody on a display stage and then they come over here and they're all trying to teach, and the most they can get down is to an intellectual curiosity. If I say something that you think, man, that's what I believe, he's really not as dumb as I thought he was. Right? Isn't that how it works? And so we got to move to where we forget that stuff, and then the contact and the transformation that comes from the transfer of information. And you get honest replies then. They'll tell, but Mom, that's not really how I feel. Or, Dad, I can't do that just because you want to do it. I don't think I can do it. So, on the clock here, if we're going to get through the 4 areas, but any other questions you want to raise about that process? I just want you to be aware of it and recognize it as an important factor in becoming an agency-oriented educator, whether you're a parent or not. Yes?
I'm hoping you'll answer how we reach that point together.
Exactly.
How do we get there? How do we get to the contact?
Who do you have in your experience where you've made that happen?
I homeschool my kids. I see it daily. Sometimes they're right here, and the next hour we're in contact again, and sometimes I'm here. And so how do we make more contact and less being on the outside of that?
What's that on your finger on your left hand?
That would be a wedding ring.
And what does it represent? That you and somebody else kind of got down there really pretty good, right?
Right. Right.
Now, what did you have to do in order to make that happen?
A lot of work.
And what did he go through?
He was the learner.
Humble man.
A lot of time spent together, a lot of respect for one another.
I think you already know the answer that you asked me. What are you going to tell me to do about my kids? The biggest thing is be aware of where you're at. And then you'll get lots of help from your own experience. You can get help from the Spirit. You can get help from the person. They would rather be down there with you, usually. But whatever peer group pressures or prior experiences with you or whatever, it seldom, if ever, happens to a 6-month-old. They're there. And then you have to decide whether you want to go where they're at. But a 16-year-old isn't always there. And then you have to decide, well, now what? We'll talk about that in just a minute. I think a couple of things we're going to do after this will give you something more in the toolbox to work with. Next slide. Here's one way of looking at educational experience in the more formal setting, because this is a conference along those lines too, and we've talked a lot about that. This is a conventional modern curriculum wheel. And you've got social studies and language arts stuff, and then you've got science, and then you got mathematics. Underneath each of those titles, curriculum titles, because you've all been in the schoolrooms where they said, put away your arithmetic books, you know, back in elementary days, and get out your reading books. So you went from math to language arts. Well, today we're going to do dance, or we're going to have music, or we're going to, there's a whole bunch of things you do under the language and arts umbrella. And what is really happening, and the reason we do those kinds of things in our traditional educational patterns, and I'm not talking just about schools, whether they're government or church or whatever kinds of schools, the schools that are in our home and our relationships with each other are it's the same idea. There are things that people like, and the reason they like them is because they have an intellectual capacity to deal with subjective evaluation. Evaluation means to choose something, to evaluate, to find some value in something. And that's subjective. It's different than studying math and the times tables. In it, we learn how to exercise this intellectual capacity, and it allows us to enhance ourselves and our experience. And let's see if we, let me just read 4 items here. Under objective evaluation, that's what happens when we do comparative social studies. And comparative social studies can be anything from, well, that's not the way we do it in our home, just because your friends do it that way in their home. So you're asking them to exercise their intellectual capacity to do. Subjective means you personally do it. The learner, the child, if you're talking about that, or you, the teacher, decides what's beautiful or isn't, what's appropriate or not. That can all be just personal, subjective, finding value in whatever it is, whether it's art or music or dance or literature, poetry. All of that fits in that chunk of the curriculum. Now, when we go to social studies, then we do this objective evaluation. So we'll learn about the Eskimos and how it is to live where the snow is around most of the year. We'll learn what they eat and where they get it from the seals and whales and fish and whatever. Or we can study something in the Polynesian Islands, and that's the reef, and that's where the food comes from, and that's where, so you've got all of these different cultural environments, and they're something that we can compare. That's what they call social studies. And originally, that's why they put social studies in the curriculum, is so we could understand that the people in Africa are not living in exactly the same way the people in Europe are living. So if you go back to medieval education and study that history, and all of that went on, complicated by lots of other influences, that was cultural, comparative, social interactions. And we've developed whole fields to do that kind of a thing. Archaeology, anthropology, all of these so-called disciplines, they fit in one or the other of these, under these umbrellas. And what I'm suggesting to you is that if you're going to be an agency-oriented educator, it's important to look beyond the fact we're comparing the Polynesian culture with the Eskimo culture and understand what it is in the human intellect that we're trying to enhance. That's what we want to enhance, because those cultures will come and go. That's the virtue of going with the latest lapel attached microphone. I'm not a good one to just keep staring at that. I don't sing well, so I don't get my mouth down there and then start off on some song. Then you go to science, and that's another intellectual capacity. And it's not just these four. You can make a long list of attributes of the intellect that are important to us personally. And you can see that all of them don't fit under these curriculum things. And sometimes we intentionally move some of them out. And that's a wheel, and you notice 2 question marks in it. And in our culture now, we've kicked out character education. The idea of values and standards that was the hub of the wheel originally. If you go back to the early readers in American education, and you know there was 150 years of intense, make the hub of the wheel be a guide for all of those things that we do in the other, out on the spokes. But science is logical inductive. It allows us to do divergent thinking. We talk about thinking outside the box. But if this is something that you can visually just illustrate quickly. I throw this up and I catch it. That's 1, 2, and I dropped it. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I've gathered some objective evidence. Now, if I throw this up, then what's going to happen to it? What do you predict? That's science. You look at this and this and this and this, and then you use inductive, divergent, inductive thinking. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then you predict this is going to happen. And you do it every day, and I do it every day. Everybody does it every day. But what we want to think about is when we're educating somebody, whether it's our children, and that's the major focus here that we have, we want them to develop those qualities in that capacity. And if we can ever help them to understand that's why they're studying what they're studying is to enhance their own intellect, then all of a sudden there's a whole new element of agency that just comes up and it solves all kinds of discipline problems. I used to go and watch student teachers, and we'd have the ones we were training at BYU go out and do student teaching. And they would spend 6 or 8 weeks of a term under the direction of a local teacher. I noticed that some of those teachers had different patterns of student responses to their instruction. And so did these young people that were training to go out there, and they worked with them for a period of time. And there were a few of them, not most of them, but a few of them, they could leave their classroom, those kids would never go off task. And they wouldn't talk to each other. They would be doing what they're supposed to be doing the way the teacher wanted them to do it and the way they wanted to do it. That's why they were not bothering their neighbor. And then we'd have those student teachers say, I'd like to be able to teach like he does or like she does. And then they would try. but they wouldn't all succeed. Why wouldn't they all succeed? What happens in that setting that one teacher had tuned in on, that those new teachers to be were wanting to tune in on, but mostly didn't. And neither did the other teachers in that school either. Can you tell me what it was?
The kids' individual personalities.
Yeah, but it's a little bit more than that, because you got 28 of them,
Their
or
imagination.
30.
So the basic.
You're getting closer to it.
Love and respect.
That's still an element. But the thing that was happening was he was tuning in to those kids and getting them to work on enhancing their intellectual capacity. And that's one step below what they were studying, whether it was science or art or whatever. And think about that, and you'll see it, because you'll see it in your own kids. Some of them are really progressive in one sense with the talents that they have, and others are a little different and they're doing another thing. So there's individual differences on this, but all of them are using curriculum as a means to a better end. It's not just an end in and of itself. And that's why the missing hub is really important, because we're all supposed to be developing elements of our character that'll provide us the optimum opportunity to enhance our intellect. Joseph Smith said there's never been a person born that didn't have the capacity to increase the powers of his intellect. But the powers are in something, not just stuff that we're studying as a subject, but it's about developing this in the mind. Deductive thinking, mathematics. We learn that in the early years, 2 plus 2 equals 4. Now, how do you know that's true? Or what did the math teacher tell you? Well, maybe it's easier if I used a little, I shouldn't use the same number. 3 minus 2 equals what? 1. How do you prove that to a math teacher?
Option.
You add 1 to 2 that equals 3. You start with a proposition in math. In science, you go with events and try to figure out something that you can predict. In math, you start with a proposition that 3 minus 2 equals 1, and you go 1 plus 2 equals 3, proves the internal consistency, the integrity of your answer. And as all algebra is turning that on its side and putting A's and B's and X's and Y's in it. And that's what we have when we have a formula. So you got this side of the formula is always supposed to what? Equal, in order to validate what you thought was the true core. If you're going to put a man on the moon and you got to figure out all that stuff, you have chalkboards full of symbols. But in mathematics, those are based on propositions that you've proven that he can get from here to the moon. And he does it through formulas that represent forces and influences and factors and material that will transport them there. That's all that, it's all that solid in math. And that's why we think mathematics is a good thing for kids to learn, Not because mathematics is a good thing to learn, it is, but it's more important that mathematics helps you develop your capacity for deductive thinking. And you'll find some of your children are more gifted at deductive thinking when they get here than others were. And we can all kind of get better at it, and some of us love it, and some of us don't love it as much. And so we'll go up and do social studies, or we'll get interested in music, or we can go where our talents will take us, but we must remember that it's important to develop the intellectual capacities. Any comments you want to make about that? Did I say anything that was new or disturbing to you? Did any of it make any sense?
No.
No?
No,
Okay.
you were explaining about the person who was student teaching, and they couldn't figure out the difference between their lack of success and the teacher's success, helping the kids be invested.
So they didn't have to have discipline problems.
And did you say that the key was that he was focusing on intellectual?
No, he didn't even need to know that. It was that in his relationship with those children, he was somehow, through his personality, dealing with them in a way where they were feeling growth and development in these capacities of the intellect, and that mesmerized their attention of where to invest their time and energy and interest. And they were willing to go with him because they were getting self-satisfaction out of it.
Because they could recognize their progress.
Yes, and they felt that. And we're intuitively blessed with that outcome, and it causes us to refocus how we all are stuck with time, energy, and resources. That's what we own. Legitimate resources, but time and energy and resources. Everything else is added on stuff. And if you want people to invest their time and their energy and their interest in something, they've got to get a payoff somehow. And with whatever he had, I'm thinking of one guy that was from out in the Uinta Basin someplace, and you wouldn't have ever imagined him being a psychologist or anything like that. But he had a relationship with the kids where he was tuning in to these capacities that were allowing them to feel socially comfortable and personally investing in what he was rewarding them for in some way, either with his personality, but eventually they were willing to just go right along that path. And I remember talking to the principal saying, how come most of your teachers aren't doing what he does? I don't know, he says, but the parents line up. They want their wayward children that are not doing much good in school to be in his class, because as soon as he gets them, he's got about 3 or 4 weeks, and then they're just tracking like that. And I had a student teacher that worked with him for about, I don't know how many weeks, and she wanted to be that kind of a teacher. And she found out there was a lot of things she had to do introspecting in her own self, and she was finding her way, and eventually she got to be kind of like that teacher, but not the way he did it, because she did what she owned and got the same results with the students that she was working with. And there was one other female teacher in that school that was just as good at it as he was, and there was 10 or 15 other teachers in that school that they had to use external forces and threats of grades, and they were doing other kinds of compensatory systems to get the kids to do what they were supposed to do. But it's a lot better when they do what they are supposed to do without you having to make them do it, right? And we all go through that, so it's a matter of, that's one of the challenges of becoming an agency educator. And you will find your own answers, just like I've watched others find their answers, and others try and fail and not find it, because I don't have the answer to that. But I don't think it's because they can't. I just don't think they kind of get however their personality is going to mesh. And we sort of set it up for ourselves. We get more comfortable just doing it with the people that respond the way we like to have them respond. We get comfortable. And we don't make the necessary changes in ourselves to reach a broader scope. But it's a lot easier to do it in the family than it is to do it in a schoolroom with 30 kids in junior high. Next slide. Next. Now here's another barrier that kind of becomes critical on the practical end of things. We all go through a series of challenges in life that represent the appearance of attributes that are just inherent in the human being. And when a baby is born, up to about age 7 to 10, or 7 through 9 basically, where the research has confirmed it, something happens then that makes them different in how they respond to their environments. When they're 0 to 8 or 9, they're pretty much willing, let's use authority as an example here, they're pretty much willing to accept a significant adult in their life as being the authority figure. They perceive authority as a person, not as a principle. They don't have that capacity as much. And I'm sure there's all kinds of seemingly exceptions to this model that I'm trying to articulate here, but something happens about the advent of conscience in our lives where mentally we become a little more able to do some things than we were unable to do before. And with this acquisition, things begin to change in how we perceive and respond to our experiences in life. Because that next, some people call it the latent stage, but that next stage of life is more and more governed by this capacity that we have to recognize who and what we are and what things outside of us are really outside of us. And it's a long ways from being a baby in a crib looking at his hand and wondering what that is without ever thinking about it's connected to an arm that's connected to a shoulder that's connected to me. They don't get that. And so whatever you're going to try to teach them, there's no use trying to teach them something they don't have the development to respond to. And then we go through a period of time where authority now turns into a principle. And that happens sometime between 11 and 14 when puberty comes into play. The power of procreation is released in the human organism, and it changes the nature of that organism. And mentally, we're different after that. Spiritually, we're different than after that. Physically, we're different after that. And you can see I've taken the authority on this third column there. It's okay when they're little children, 5, 6, don't run in the street. Why? Because mommy said so. You'll get hurt, she might add, or you'll get killed, but they don't process that. They just say, mommy said don't run in the street. And you use that vernacular when you say, because I said so. Or when they get to the conscience age, now they're going to be understanding authority as a rule That's a rule in our house. So I'm going to have to obey the rules. And if you don't believe that's physiologically and intellectually true, volunteer for service out in the playground at any elementary school, spend an hour there, and watch when the kids have problems. They'll run to the teacher. If they were 5 years old, they'll come to the teacher and say what? What would they usually say if they're 5? Johnny's hitting me, or somebody's pulling my hair, or whatever the transgression is. They'll want who to solve it? You. You're the teacher. You're where authority is. But not when they're 10 and they come to the teacher. They'll say, Tommy is doing what? Breaking the rules. They'll just, and if you don't believe this is true, just set them down and let them play one of the table games or something, Monopoly. The 4-year-old will see all that stuff on that board, and there's that stack of money, and he'll go, whee, that's fun. But his sister, who's about 10 years old, if she's trying to get him to play Monopoly with her, what's she going to say? He doesn't even understand the rules. That's where that goes. And then you got the 16 and 17-year-old that's already through puberty, and now they park their car in the faculty parking area. They call him into the principal's office. What's the principal going to say? You can't park your car in the faculty parking area. Why not? That's why. Why not? Already that capacity now is searching for rationale that's beyond just the personality or just an abstract rule. They want to know, what is it that causes us to have that rule? I'm smarter than the faculty is. I'm better looking than the faculty is. Why can't I park where they park? And when they land that on you as a parent, and if they're not there yet, I will be prophetic enough to say you'll hear about it sometime in the future. And that principal's kind of got a challenge on his hands with his relationships with those kinds of kids. He could say, because I said you can't park there. And that's probably the mechanism the football coach is using. But there's other issues involved here. And getting a child who wants to learn at the principal level, you have to allow that to happen by you getting on the principal level. And we need to all stand up right now and do head, shoulders, knees, and toes, I think, because I know people get tired of sitting here. So just for 2 minutes, let the blood run the other way. Escape is possible without intervening anything or impugning it. While you're just standing there, I'll conclude this particular thing, and we can talk about it as much as you want, but there's a kind of a good rule to follow, and that is before puberty, it's better to focus on a person's actions than it is intentions. That's when you're free to be dealing with the issues of their lives at a level they're comfortable dealing with it. They know if they've done the wrong thing, and you can explain that that's not in accordance with the way we live our lives here. You don't do whatever it is you didn't think he ought to do or she ought to do. And you've already set those standards and you're operating your family with them. After puberty, though, if you just focus on the actions, you're going to complicate the relationship you have with them. It's going to be difficult because they want to deal, even though they're not fully prepared, to deal with the intentions. If you say, be home by 6 o'clock, that's when we eat here, you can make that a kind of a rule in your house, but they can figure out all kinds of ways of challenging that rule because they're searching for principles by their nature of their development. And you can tell them that you can't wear that kind of a skirt to school, you can't do that to your hair, you shouldn't be doing that to your body. You can go through a long list of things that are common, but it all breaks down into the same. I'm using family here. Everything I'm saying works in interpersonal relationships with your spouse or your neighbors or anybody else. And it's also in all the classrooms that ever exist. You've got to know where the development process is of the people you're dealing with. And then somebody's going to raise a question and say, well, what about people that get locked in and they don't ever get to develop at that appropriate stage? And that's rehab. And we've got prisons all around the country that are filled with people that got stuck and didn't get up to the level or acquire the fortitude that comes and the blessing that comes from abiding by a correct principle. And so they violate some that society has said, that's enough. And so we're going to put you someplace where you won't interfere with everybody else. But when that happens in your own home with your own kids, we can do a lot more if we understand some simple issues that they're going through. And you know more about this collectively than I do, but I understand enough about it, I think I can articulate that's a generic issue. It's difficult, even dealing with a loved one, to say, well, this is what you did, and then try to keep the conversation going at that end without ever allowing the other person to say, but this is what I intended to do. And if they want to have the discussion on the intention and you force them to talk about the action, that's going to be a standoff. And getting the skill level, which when I say skill level, I just mean getting the awareness in your own self and learn how to do that yourself. And you heard that expressed in all those testimonials that were given this morning. When I sat back there and listened to them talk, I was just watching them go through these things just like this. And you sat out there and did the same thing. You were empathizing with some of the things they were saying, and you weren't empathizing with other things they were saying. And some of you had questions you'd like to say, but in my case, if I'd have done that, this would have been this. Or I wouldn't have felt like you felt when you did it. So it's a matter of, if you want to really be an agency-oriented education, you've got to become aware of what you're doing with your own agency, and you need to be able to understand what they're doing with their agency and what you're allowing them to do or what you're wishing they would do. And once you get the kids to the point where, like teacher did, however he was guiding them through his, I think they were probably about 7th graders or something like it was junior high school, he had them just tracking. And I don't know how he kept them going through that. Oh, I didn't stay there for the whole year. And I don't know how he ever arrived at that point. But I know he was there, and I know the kids knew he was there, and I know the parents knew that he was there. And it made a difference. And we're all capable of that. It's not just somebody is the gifted person and everybody else can't do it. That's not true at all. It's just there are principles of harmony that occur as the human matures if we think about it a little bit. Next one. And just to show a little example of how this works through life, to indicate the few little examples we've talked about. Look at these two lines here, self-control versus outside control. Once you get children that you can trust to do what you know would be in their best interest and your best interest, you call that self-control. They have reached that point. Collectively, we're all trying to go like this and get more over into the yellow and grow out of the orange. And that's a full-time job. And it doesn't end when, at any given point along there, I'm chewing up 84. And I'm still working on getting from here to there. All of us go through that same sequence. And you can put this together and look at it through glasses of every kind of curriculum issue that might be raised. And all this stuff we're hearing about who's supposed to control education, and what's the parents' responsibility, and what can we delegate to society, and what should we be doing about it? This undergirds that as well. Next slide. I don't know whether we need to spend much time here, but that chart shows the way morality has been removed from much of our lives and replaced with situational ethics, man-made, culturally imposed propositions. And we're going through all kinds of undulations of that in our society right now. And it's all intertwined with the political, the economic, and the educational enterprises that are functioning and spilling over into our personal lives and our families. And this isn't the place or time to delve into that, but just recognizing that we've come a long ways away, and we took that track because we moved most of the nation's sets of assumptions about education over to that secular side. And we've abolished. David O. McKay announced that way back in the Relief Society in the late 1950s, when he said, when they made the rule that you could no longer pray in the classroom, we cut the umbilical cord between heaven and earth. And that pattern is behind this movement there. Next slide. This is one way to look at where we're at as we try to get to the deeper levels of what agency really entails if we're going to operate it ourselves and expect others to learn about it and adhere to it themselves. And that is, we all start out, we're all experts on the first column, show, tell, and do. Everybody does that instinctively once they're a parent, it just operationally becomes your daily life. You show them and you tell them, and then you get them to practice it. Whether it's shoelaces they're trying to tie, or whether it's cleaning their room, or whatever it is, it's show, tell, and do. But if you're going to have an impact in the agency domain, it's got to go beyond show, tell, and do. And that movement is illustrated on the third column, where we are invoked to teach according to certain covenants, and those can be not just the ones we make with our Heavenly Father, but the ones we make with each other. Teach by the Spirit and teach as a witness. And you could spend a lot of time thinking through that as a way of connecting those 4 quadrants of the curriculum back to the intellectual capacities that are in each of us and in each of our children. And we want to enhance those. And some of them are going to enhance them more in one direction or another than others, because they've got gifts and talents, and they're more facile at getting certain things to happen for them. And they may not be exactly the same as the way you did it in your life, or I did it in mine. And so I've got to enable them in any way I can to find that. And one of the best methods of doing that is to have them succeed in exercising that with math, language arts, science, and those are all good things, social studies. But remember, they're not the end. And that's what our culture's wanting to say, oh, it's all over now. That's the end. No, it isn't the end. It's a means to an end. And it's been a good means. You'll learn how to use numbers. You'll learn how to make subjective evaluations. You learn how to do comparative evaluations. You learn how to inductively think, and you learn how to deductively think. But you learn about a whole bunch of other intellectual capacities. And those are not the only 4. And you can't say that just because I did a really good job in them, I'm the greatest citizen around. It doesn't pan out that way. And there's a whole moral domain, because you believe the building blocks in reality are 2 and not just 1, from back where we started with that. Let's go to the next one. This particular standard was the 4th one that I wanted to emphasize. And it says, teach learners personal self-denial, responsibility, and stewardship. Now, we can talk about those 3 elements, and they are the core, I think, for any person that wants to be an agency-oriented educator. You don't have to be so much up on these if you want to be an individualist educator, or if you want to be a secular societal educator, or if you want to be a parochial educator. But if you're going to be in the education agency company, and that's your basic premise and want to be, they need to understand the value of personal self-denial. And in our public school books now, that's all been washed out. You can't find a textbook that emphasizes that we should teach self-denial.
That's in what would be an example of? Don't make sure you don't eat as much sugar, or what are you?
I'm talking about how do you get a person to recognize that he needs or she needs to deny themselves of doing whatever they want to do, however they want to do it, whenever they want to do it. But their society teaches them, do whatever you want to do, however you want to do it, whenever you want to do it, and that's your right. And that's at the root of the whole squabble about religious liberty, if you get down to the bottom of it. Right, and you can't have the kind of agency that sustains a society if that agency isn't rooted in standards. And all those standards have come historically by revelation. And that's why we go back to the Garden of Eden story if we wanted to.
So we have some agency curriculums and ideologies out there in print
Yep.
that espouse this. Learning is any way you want to learn it, anytime you want to learn it, any way you want to learn it, and anytime you feel like it.
And that isn't agency education the way those 4 quadrants are created when you put those 2 axes in there. That's why I said what you use to think with when you think about curriculum or education in general or spouse relationships or you parent-child relation. Agency education is connected to standards, and those standards have been given. And when we don't live or measure our plans around those standards, it's like building a house out of straw versus building it out of brick, if you want to go back to the 3 little pigs. So I would just say, when you start thinking like that, see, that's raised a question in your mind, right?
Yeah.
Say, I saw something there. It's not agreeing exactly with what I seem to be thinking when I listen to you talk about this. That's the sequence.
I'm just noticing that the term agency seems to take on quite a different definition in different groups.
It does because we changed the definitions. We changed the definition of what is a value, what is morality. You've got, well, morality is, this is one of the, and we could put up charts endlessly about that, but like when in Rome, do what the Romans do. But that's situational ethics. It's not morality. If we take the standard Judeo-Christian definition of morality, morality is conforming to a principle that was given to you that was for your benefit and the benefit of others. And so you've got to think that whole thing. How do you create a moral school? I wrote 300 pages about that and never did anything with them, but anyway, it's a big topic. And when you try to make application of it down to a level of implementation, you run into the very kind of thing you're raising now. Because what's their intention? That's where the conversation needs to go. This is what they say. Why did they say it? And then in order to have a conversation with him, instead of a fight, you've got to find out, well, what do you really mean then? Well, if that's what you really mean, you better change this to be a means to an end and not the end of when you feel like it, how you feel like it, where you feel like it, whenever you feel like it. Because that denies personal, that refutes personal denial. Yes?
There's another thing at play here. Elder Robbins just talked about it at Education Week about being 100% responsible, but how you can't have, if you have agency and responsibility, the Lord always pairs those together, and the adversary will separate those. And if you're talking about them separately, you know who's at work, that it's not the Lord. So that might be a test too. If you're only talking about agency and not responsibility, you know it's coming from a source other than.
All right, you've raised the question that I think we should try to answer here, at least explore. And let me try to do that by asking the question, what is a value? What is a value? Question mark. You've got a piece of paper And if I ask you to turn it over and write that question down and say, what is a value question mark? And then I said, all right, I'll give you 10 minutes and see what you can write down. I'm not going to do that here now because you've already been sitting too long today, but you need to do that. You need to know what is a value. And then a second question that you need to find an answer to personally, because getting these answers comes back to dealing with these issues that you're raising. And you're raising those issues because I'm putting up a potpourri of whatever that I'm putting up there. And they're legitimate and they're real for you. And so if I was to answer what is a value, I'll give you an example. I'm having a hard time keeping up with where I'm supposed to go. Yeah, do you want to hold it? You be the easel and I'll do the writing, and then I can keep the mic where it's supposed to be. I'm going to go back to the Garden of Eden story. That's just a really simple place, but you've got life plus a place plus a capacity to choose. I'll shorten one step here. And to act upon that choice. Now, action, if we come back over here, that action becomes an investment of time, energy, and whatever legitimate resources that you might possess. That's what creates a value. When you start acting on your investment, then you either don't act responsibly to protect it, or you do act responsibly to protect it. So you could say simply, responsibility oops, that's not a very good way to spell that. I know how to solve that right now.
It's all subjective.
Yes, subjective evaluation. There we get closer. Responsibility is acting to protect your investments of time, energy, and resources. And it's irresponsible to not act to protect your investments. If your investment is in marriage and you act to protect all that you put into that, time, energy, and resources, and you make a tremendous investment. Or you have a child, you make a tremendous investment in that child. And when you act responsibly, you try to protect your investment. And when you don't protect your investment, you're not being responsible. That's the standard you intuitively hold your children to. You bought the car. They're not supposed to take the key and scratch up and down the paint job, because that's acting irresponsible to your investment. But when they go out and abuse themselves, they're not acting responsible from a certain set of assumptions that they should be protecting. Do you see? And that's the whole story of the two trees in the Garden of Eden, and Adam and Eve. That's how it all started. Here they were given life, they had a place, and agency is one part of agency is a place, the geographical location. Like if you're an insurance agent, you have a territorial kind of whatever. We still use it the same way. It's a place, but it's also, in addition to a place, a capacity that we have to do things. And that was to make choices. I tell you this is the way to do it, but if you want to do it some other way, just remember there's consequences of whatever you're going to try out. And have I made that clear enough? Or ask questions if you want, and I'll try to respond to where you're coming from enough to, so you'll understand what I've just said. Because you were asking a question that was kind of, but you've told us this, but what about? And then I'm trying to give you, well, this is an example of what about. You can come up with your own if you want, but that's the way you can look at it. It's not, I'm not telling you that's the way you have to look at it, but it works for me at least.
And then the other side of it is that once you decide, like you have your life and the place or capacity to choose, and then you look forward and think, well, if I choose this, what do I think is going to happen? But if I choose this, what do I think is going to happen?
And now you're playing with inductive thinking.
Then you have to make a choice and live with the consequences.
Or else you start with deductive thinking and says, the Lord says this is what will happen. Well, I'm going to deduce that if I do this and this and this, that's what's going to happen.
So Eve actually had to be very wise, I think. I don't think she made a mistake.
Neither does the Lord.
I don't know.
That's why we have a different theology than some people have. But anyway, that's kind of a quick, simple explanation. Any other questions about responsibility or, what was the first one?
Agency.
Well, before I started to do that, the denial business that we just talked about. Personal denial. If our youth are going to learn about personal denial, it's going to have to be taught in the homes. We have external forces in place in the society that will punish people if they don't deny themselves of certain things. Theft. The person that goes into Walmart and steals can get caught. But there's also a standard out there in the ethical domain that says it's not a matter that the stealing was wrong. It was you were caught. It was being caught that was the violation, not the fact you stole what you did. So they've got all kinds of ways of organizing responses to this in our society. But personal self-denial is critical for agency education to work. Somehow, however you are able to transfer, transmit, share that sense with your children will be one of the greatest gifts you'll ever give them. And then when we go to responsibility, you have to have some notion about what is a value and how do we acquire it.
How did you go about teaching your kids?
Ask that lady with the gray hair right there.
How did you go about teaching your kids about the self-denial especially?
Oh, how did you go about teaching our children self-denial?
And why?
And why?
What was the reason behind it that got them thinking?
I think I
I had a good husband that could do that.
Okay, so you go to her, you go to her. It must be God.
She's not telling the whole truth. Part of, I can respond. She, by herself, has internalized enough that they were against the rock wall. And so when they went in the store and they had a weakness, we had twin sons, okay? Here they are with their mother then, or great grandmother now, but you go in the store and they pick up a piece of candy. I like candy. And they were young. And so when they got to the checkout stand, he never pulled it out of his pocket to pay for it. But when he got in the car, his twin brother said, "Do you know what David did?"
So that would be an example of self-denial that you're talking about.
But that's not how we taught it to him. That was an example of it being violated.
Right.
And so what did you think his mother did?
I think she probably took him, explained why it was.
Oh,
and reminded
she's.
him of the commandment and took her back to the store. And he had to talk to the manager or whatever and give it back. Or, I don't know which.
And when they were throwing rocks at the cars that came down the road and the neighbors squealed on them and all of that, it's there. We had 7. We got 37 grandkids. We got 7 great-grandkids and more to come. And the farther away from that you get, the more you can share the responsibility. Now I'll hold his dads accountable. But I don't have much say anymore. So that's an interesting thing. Yes?
Another way to teach the self-denial is service opportunities like we talked about this morning. Community service, devoting a day a week, helping refugees. You can't help but come away from that realizing, wow, I could deny myself of a lot of other things because they live without them all the time.
Oh, and send them on a mission to a poor country. Yeah, there's lots of ways. We have ample opportunity to experience whatever we need to experience, to apply it in a way that we could channel into that agency quadrant. But we don't want to get confused about it when different aspects of it are isolated and then say, do whatever you want, however you want, whenever you want, and that's the way to have the motivation filled in the child. But that's not the safe way to have it filled. The safest way to have it filled, I should say. And so you've got the answers. It's just create your own matrix for how you're going to do that. And we've gone through 4 or 5 examples this afternoon that you could use, and you can go back and review it because he'll put those slides up, and they'll trigger all kinds of thoughts in your mind that was nothing I ever could have transferred to you that will be beneficial and for your value. That's what a workshop on the intellect does for you. Now, there's other ways to do workshops. If we wanted to teach you to be carpenters, we got to get some boards and saws and some other things in here to do a workshop. But today, the workshop was, what can I do with their minds while I've got 2 hours to do it with? And I'm not going to go for 2 hours. So they're too tired, and I've learned out of information. But I got to end with the chicken, and that's stewardship. And this is one of the challenges that we have with agency educators, parents, children, others that want to be in that quadrant. We've got to learn what stewardship is so that we don't try to be straddling into areas that are not really what we need to be concerned about. And it's just like you try to teach it, that's his room. If that's what he wants in his room, it's not your job to go in and tell him what he's supposed to do as his sibling or whatever might be going on in the home. Stewardship is vital. And Personal denial is vital, and responsibility is vital. And if you got those three things, a grip on them, you will become that kind of a person that will be delivering that kind of a message, but it will depend on the first thing we talked about when we said, are you afraid when you do it? Or are you wanting it on display when you do it? Or are you down there sharing it heart to heart, feeling to feeling? And the best method I know, the most successful effort I've made with volumes of students, is setting that chart up there and having them tell each other where they're at in the relationship that I, as their teacher, was trying to create. And when they get on that plane, I've won a lot of battles for myself, because then I can relax and I don't have to be afraid of myself or be so self-concerned about how I look or how I speak, or this is terrible to have a thing going on all during the time taking a picture of me, plus listening to my words. When did I stop in half sentences, and when did I violate the English standards that you wanted me to keep living by, which are yours, maybe not mine? I got to get rid of all of that and not worry about it, because that's self-inhibiting. And I can't just stand up here and say, well, I put my coat on so I'd look like I knew more than I do. That's not really going to help out a great deal. You can yell in the Marriott Center all you want, but you may not make much contact. But most of it depends on the fact that I'm one person and you're 25. What's my chance of overpowering 25 other intellects? Not very much. Because you're going to, just like the blonde lady who left, whatever, she was great. That she says, I've been thinking about it. She was an intellectual observer at the moment. She didn't stay there because she relaxed a little bit after I invaded her space. Anyway, it's been a privilege to spend a little time with you talking about some of the things that are involved in being agency educators, and I just wish you the best. But I want to tell you, I know, and I have a witness, that you're equipped to do it. Because all you got to do is make it a priority. You got to invest, and then you've got to be responsible with protecting your investments, however you want to define that in terms of your stewardship. And that mother hen's doing her best with her stewardship right there. May the Lord bless you to this end, and thank you.